My story today begins in Scotland, in the border regions of Ayrshire, by the town of Kilmarnock, in the village of Alberta. Here my great-grandfather, George Fleming, married Maggie Brown on April the 30th, 1872, and they set up home in this humble cottage. Family lore has it that great-grandpa Fleming ran a tavern in Alberta. In an old family Bible, 2 of George and Maggie's children were listed as being born at the Alberta Inn. I found a listing online for the Cleckham Inn by Alberta that names George Fleming and James Brown as having an involvement with it. So this most likely is the tavern mentioned in family lore. Brown was my great-grandmother's maiden name, and though I don't know for sure, James Brown might have been her father, and thus my great-great-grandfather. The Cleckham Inn was torn down, leaving only an empty signpost and crumbling foundation in a roadway by the road by Alberta. My cousin Gail Werthers found and photographed the old Fleming cottage on a farm near Alberta and let me know about it. On my visit to Scotland in 2010, I visited the cottage on the farm owned by the Tobin family. The cottage was not much bigger than my detached one-car garage back home. At the time of my visit, it was being used as a storage shed for the farm, with a more modern barn attached to it. Back in the day, its interior would have looked something like this. According to a notebook my grandfather had, between 1873 to 1886, my grandmother gave birth to 8 children, of which 4 died in childhood or very young. Of the remaining 4 children, only the youngest, William, remained in Scotland and ran a shop until his death in 1958. He never married and has no descendants. Which brings us to George, the oldest of the 4, who immigrated to Canada and worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway and died in Fort William in 1958 at the age of 83. And Robert, who immigrated to the United States and died in California in 1939 at the age of 58. This brings us to the last of the brothers, my grandfather, John Fleming, whose story we will look at next in this video. As the 19th century ended and the 20th century began, my grandfather entered into adulthood and became a blacksmith. At the tail end of the Victorian era and into the Edwardian era, the poorest parts of Great Britain were northern England and Scotland. My grandfather considered his prospects in Scotland, where, since the Flemings didn't own farmland, farming was not really an option. He could move to a large city such as Glasgow or London and join the throngs in the factories and slums, but to him the best prospect was to immigrate. Since his older brother George was already in Canada, that is where he headed. So on May the 8th, 1909, from the port of Glasgow, Scotland, he boarded ship for Canada. I still have my grandfather's landing card from when the ship docked in Canada on May the 17th, 1909. From this card, I learned that the ship he sailed on was the Athena, owned by the Donaldson Line. With this information, I went online and found the ship's passenger manifest for this voyage, and my grandfather's name appears on page 2. From the manifest, I learned that my grandfather only had $30 on him when he landed in Canada and was headed to Port Arthur, where his brother George was. My grandpa Fleming returned to Scotland and married Mary Ferguson, my grandmother. On March the 10th, 1911, my grandparents set out from Glasgow on the CPR ship the Empress of Britain to return to Canada. Again, I found their names on the ship's passenger manifest on page 5, lines 7 and 8. Their ultimate destination in Canada was Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. Grandpa and Grandma Fleming's ship landed them in St. John's, New Brunswick. From St. John's, New Brunswick, they would have proceeded by train to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. I don't know why my grandparents went to Moose Jaw or how long they stayed there, but it could not have been very long, as by June 1914 they were in Calgary, Alberta, where my dad, George Fleming, was born, followed in 1916 by my Uncle John Fleming, and in December 1917 by my Aunt Agnes Fleming. In the 1920s, the Flemings were on the move again and wound up in Mountain Park, a coal mining town located in the Coal Branch area of Alberta near the present town of Catamount. They lived in a house provided by the coal company. I asked my Aunt Agnes where their home was located in the town, and she said it would have been somewhere around here. For my dad and his two siblings, their time in Mountain Park was among the happiest period of their lives. In this photo, we see my dad George on the left holding the newspapers, my Aunt Agnes in the middle, and Uncle John on the right with the paper bag. We will continue my story by learning a bit more about my Aunt Agnes Fleming. Aunt Agnes was super smart, and after finishing high school, attended normal school to become a teacher. After graduating, she returned to Mountain Park and taught at the school there. Here we see Aunt Agnes with her class. I count 50 students in this photo, and they would have been rough and tumbled working class kids, but so was Aunt Agnes, so I'm sure she had no problem handling such a large classroom. Aunt Agnes was not done with education. She obtained a business degree and taught at Carleton University. She then attended the University of Alberta and was among the first women in Alberta to receive a law degree in 1956 when she was 38 years old. She joined one of the major law firms in Edmonton and remained with them for the next 36 years, becoming one of the leading experts in Alberta on the practice of wills and estates. In 1968, she was made a Queen's Counsel, which is the top level for a lawyer, just below being a judge. She loved art and world travel, visiting many different parts of the world. Over the years, she gathered a large art collection that completely covered the walls of her home. In later life, she told me one of her regrets was she never married and had no children of her own. Aunt Agnes passed away on November the 8th, 2006, 1 month before she would have turned 89 years old. The Flemings left Mountain Park and moved to Edmonton, to this house in the Parkdale neighborhood, so as my dad and his brother and sister could attend high school. Here we see my dad, George, and Uncle John in front of this home. As the two lads grew into young men, they developed a great love of the great outdoors and camping and hunting and fishing. Eventually, they both took up a trade and learned to become electricians. We will now continue my story by learning about Uncle John's journey through life. Throughout the 1930s, Germany fell under the sway of a madman, leading in 1939 to World War II. Uncle John answered his nation's call in its time of need and joined the Royal Canadian Navy. As he was an electrician, Uncle John was assigned to a unit responsible for the maintenance and repair of gyroscopes used to stabilize the compass used for ships' navigation. By the time he left the Navy, Uncle John held the rank of petty officer. After the war, Uncle John left the Navy and returned to Edmonton, Alberta, where he helped my grandpa and dad build the family home just off of Connors Road, a house that was owned by various Flemings for the next 50 years. He met and married my Aunt Irene, and they moved to London, Ontario, where they had 3 children. My cousins John, Gail, and Karen. After a series of heart attacks in the 1970s and a massive stroke in 1983 that left him permanently paralyzed on his left side, Uncle John passed away in 1994 at the age of 77. We will continue on to learn my dad George's story. He was an electrician and took a job with Edmonton Power in the 1930s, which is now part of EPCOR, and worked there for the next 35 years, working in the company's various substations. He tried to enlist in the military in World War II, but due to a weak heart was rejected. Instead, he took it upon himself to see that my grandparents were well looked after. He married my mother, Roberta Watson, on the 8th of October, 1955, and they had my sister Mary Ann and myself. He died in 1970 of a massive heart attack. We will finish up my story by learning what became of the founders of my family in Canada, my grandparents, John and Mary. After moving to Edmonton, my grandparents remained there for the rest of their lives. My grandmother Mary passed away in 1953. After Grandma's death, Grandpa lived with Aunt Agnes in the Connors Road house that my uncle and dad built. I fondly remember Grandpa Fleming as a happy-go-lucky fellow who was always ready with a Scottish song or a lovely story, always willing to play with me and my sister. On the 20th of December, 1968, the blacksmith and the son of the proprietor of a Scottish tavern passed away in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, after leaving the old country and firmly establishing the Flemings in Canada. Till next time, everyone keep safe and well.